Hey everybody, and welcome to the Remnant Podcast. We have an amazing guest here. His name is Glen Morgon. Glen Morgon is currently the founder of We the Governed. It's a podcast that goes out, supplies amazing information about what's going on not only locally, but even nationally. He started this about 9 years ago, and he's been a conservative activist in Washington State for about 15 years now. But first of all, I want to talk about just a couple things to make some groundwork about what we're doing here. Obviously, we are in a church, and a lot of people have bought the narrative that there is a separation of church and state. So these words, separation and church and state, they do not exist in the Constitution or in any of our founding documents. It's not in the Constitution. Also, what this is about is a letter in 1802 by Thomas Jefferson. He was in response to a letter from the Baptist Church in Danbury, Connecticut. Now, this happened in October of 1801. Their concern was that the government would start imposing, like King George did, what they should do in church, imposing their doctrine, writing their sermons, and just basically destroying the church. They didn't want it. They came over here for religious liberties, and this is what they were doing. They were saying, we need to keep our religious liberties, and we need to hear from you. It did say these words in there, that there was a wall of separation. That's where they get those words. But what he was saying, what Jefferson was saying, is the wall of separation was the government to the church, not the church to the government. He wasn't saying we're taking the Christian philosophy out of our government. He was saying we're not going to let the tyranny of government affect the church. So that's basically how that whole thing worked. I want to do a quote here by Charles Finney. Charles Finney, this is what I believe the church's responsibility is, and why we have Glen here, and why we at our church in the Remnant, we talk about the things about politics. And this is just a little bit about Charles Finney. Who was Charles Finney? Charles Finney, number one, he lived in very tumultuous times. 18 to 1865, was the Civil War. There was the assassination of President Lincoln during his time, and people literally in Kansas were just killing each other on each side. Now, we always seem to think that our times are the worst, but I'll tell you what, these times were very, very, very intense. So this is a quote from Charles Finney. The church must take right ground regarding politics. Politics are part of a religion in a country like this, and Christians must do their duty to their country as a part of their duty to God. He will bless or curse this nation. Once again, I'll say that. God will bless or curse this nation according to the course of Christians take in politics. So there's no relegation of us outside of this. It is our responsibility to be right in the middle of everything. Our pastors if our pastors put boundaries up in discussing these issues, then only darkness will reign on our culture. And what's happened is most of the churches in our nation are not talking about the things about politics because they don't want to offend anybody. Let me tell you, Jesus Christ offended people every time he opened his mouth. It was always an offense to those that are perishing. That's what we know that the Bible says. So the tumultuous times we're in, we're going to turn it over here to Glen Morgon. And so go ahead and get the camera over here. Say hi, Glen.
Well, hello, everybody. And it's Pastor David. It's very good to be here. I'm happy to be here in the church, and I love, of course, talking about this subject and this topic.
You know, Glen and I go back to several times we see each other at the rallies. Yeah. We're always there supporting the conservative narrative, and I just love Glen's take on things. Glen has a great assessment of right and wrong. He has a Christian background, and I just wanted to bring him in and ask him some questions about what's going on around us right now. But the first thing is, what is the church's affiliation with not only government, but what is relegated in a lot of our church in our time outside of the narrative, and that is rapture theology. Right. And right there in Thessalonians, it says, yes, the Lord will descend with a shout and the voice of an archangel, and the whole thing is true. But what's happened is that Christians that said, well, it's going to be the rapture. We don't have to do anything. So I want Glenn to jump in here and tell a story, an important personal story in his life and his family about this subject.
I'm glad you brought that up because I know we've talked personally about it, but I've been involved in the political process quite a bit, and one of the things that I have found frequently when I'm out there working with people who share my views and our views about liberty and freedom and just the abusive cultural impacts of government right on our lives. And I found oftentimes I'll run into many Christians, and when I say many, I'm talking hundreds. So this is such a common thing. Right. And they'll tell me, I don't need to be involved, right? The rapture's going to come tomorrow. We're in the middle of end times. It's tribulation and all that. Now, I went to Christian school when I was younger. I used to hear the same story back in the 80s when I was in high school, right? In fact, I had friends that decided they didn't want to be that involved because they felt like the end of times were coming and Jesus was going to be here tomorrow. So there's no point getting involved. Right. But what really cemented this story in my mind was one of my best friends from Christian school. He went back to Wisconsin for his grandmother's 95th birthday. She was in her mid-90s. So this was about almost 30 years ago. And she was telling him a story about when she was 16, also very, Christian family, that she was 16, that she thought she would not live to see her 18th birthday because she was going to be raptured or killed in the tribulation. So this would have been around World War I, right? Clear back, way in the early 1900s. Yeah. And her discussion with my friend was to say, here I am in my mid-90s. And I had so obsessed and focused my life on what I thought was going to happen tomorrow that I made choices and decisions that may not have been as good as they could have been. And it was more of her warning him, don't live your life as though, you live your life as though the rapture's going to happen tomorrow, right? You live a good life. That's part of what that means. But you don't make decisions. You basically live as though it's never going to happen, right? You still make choices and decisions. And part of that is, I think that the way especially in America, the way Christians have often interpreted this kind of this end of times kind of rapture and tribulation, really, belief system, is that it causes them to be apathetic and to allow evil to flourish because of their apathy and their unwillingness to get involved and engage in the process. And it's really kind of a trap that they fall into. And because of that, many of the things that they bemoan that they see around them are occurring as a direct result of their apathy or their unwillingness to be involved in the process. And so that's something I find I'm fighting all the time, always have actually, out there, and encouraging people to come back in and get involved because they need to make a difference, otherwise evil flourishes.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I really, I had some statistics here I read last night at our church Wednesday night meeting. And let me see, I don't have the exact numbers, but the round numbers, Pew Research said in Washington State, there's 1.275 million people that are unregistered to vote in our state. 770,000 people and a few are Christians that are literally not voting. And I think a lot of them are confused or just using the Bible to relegate themselves outside of the system so they don't have to be worried about it. But we're living in times where I think it's time to rise up and do something about it, and at least have the conversation. They say that around the table at home or with relatives, you shouldn't talk about religion, you shouldn't talk about politics. Well,
but we find ourselves in times when you sometimes have to talk about both, right? And they aren't necessarily, there's an overlap there that occurs. And I find I work with activists all over the state of Washington with a wide spectrum of religious beliefs and affiliations. And some of them are completely not religious. Some of them aren't Christian at all. Maybe they're Hindu, maybe they're Sikh, maybe there's something else, right? Right. So I work with all kinds of people out there. And it's interesting to find the alignment, when you can find common interests in, say, maybe our state shouldn't be taking the most violent sex predators in state history and putting them right next to children's homes. Right?
Exactly.
That's probably not a radical idea, but you'd be stunned how many thousands of Christians just in this county alone were afraid to actually talk about that or do anything about that fact. And so there are those of us who were willing to stand up a couple years ago and stop it. And I find that these types of examples are endless. There's legions of these examples out there. And so we have to be willing to recognize that we have no choice. We must, if we don't involve ourselves, that's a decision to look the other way when evil or bad things are happening. If we do engage, it's not a guarantee of success, but it does ensure that you're more likely to make an impact to improve the situation that you're living in. And I find that people, it's a lazy choice to come back and say, well, I don't want to be involved because, Jesus is coming tomorrow, or there's some kind of event coming up, we're in the end times, or I see the Antichrist on the horizon, or the 7 horsemen of the apocalypse are coming, whatever the movement is. And so it's not going to matter. No, it does matter, because you have to, again, just like my friend's grandmother 120 years ago, who thought it was going to end tomorrow, right?
Right.
Just like we've seen throughout the history of Christianity for thousands of years, this has actually been a common theme that does pop up.
Yeah.
They thought it was going to end in 200 AD, right? And this repeatedly. Now we can make fun of that, looking back and saying, okay, everybody's standing on that hilltop waiting for Jesus to come tomorrow, and then it doesn't happen, right? That's an obvious failure. But it's not just because they got some kind of numerology wrong. It's inspiring them to be unengaged, uninvolved, and therefore, if you've created this vacuum where you're not involved, the people who are corrupt, who are dishonest, are the ones who get involved, and you're allowing bad things to happen.
And then they flourish.
And they flourish and they laugh at your apathy and your unwillingness and your fear, because fear and apathy are essentially, they go hand in hand, right? So a fear of standing up to evil, or at least standing up for the right thing. When you mentioned Charles Finney, in his lifetime, the church was heavily involved in slavery, getting rid of slavery. Mm-hmm. It was a huge movement in the church. If it wasn't for the church involvement for almost 60 years in America, leading up to and through the Civil War, if it wasn't for their involvement, slavery would still be around, or would have been around certainly a lot longer. Yeah. They took point on that. They were not afraid to stand up, and that was a tough and brutal fight in a time that was a lot more, there just seemed to be a lot of incredible things at stake, and they were engaged, and they were not afraid to do that. The reason why you heard Thomas Jefferson talk in 1801 about that letter, about this, is that, remember, the Constitution was new at the time, and it wasn't even clear what the First Amendment meant, and the government had jailed journalists for writing stories that the government didn't like. And they had passed if I remember right, it was like it was one of the earlier sedition acts that they had passed. That, of course, was thrown out later, but at the time, there was great fear that the government was going to come in and dictate what you were going to say, and so it took bravery to stand up and for what they believed in at the time. And I think we have to remember that's what we have to do now. The efforts of censorship or intimidation, or threatening a pastor that they're going to take away their nonprofit status if they mention who they think should be elected in office, is absurd and ridiculous, and it's an embarrassment, really, to the history of just thousands of previous Christians have stood up, and pastors that have stood up and for the right thing, even when they were genuinely being threatened by much more significant evil forces than we see today. So I think that's just trying to get people engaged and involved, and it's just one of those things that I'm continually running into out there.
Well, look as far back as Wilberforce, way back when in England. I mean, he just forever. He was against that. He lost friends. It was a big battle in his life. I love the movie.
It was.
Amazing Grace, because it gives a lot of insight. Well, the Bible says to occupy until I come. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean be sedentary, relegated to somebody else, and pretend it's going to be okay.
Right. I mean, there's nowhere in the Bible that it tells people to surrender and give up because there's no hope, right? I challenge you, and I've challenged pastors before, right? Show me in the Bible where it says preemptively surrender and give up and hide in a bunker, I mean, now there are parables, right, about hiding your bushel or hiding your candle under, and burying it, and not using your skills and your abilities to make an impact in the community in which you live. And it doesn't go well, according to Jesus' parable, for those who do that. And essentially, that's what I find Christians who have distracted themselves with this ideology, that I think that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. It has been a horrible distraction, and it's very difficult to, because we've been navigating this now for 2.5 years, and it's been very difficult because people aren't used to hearing the things that are going on politically at church.
Right.
And if you look at the prophets, what were the prophets doing? A Bible is a third prophecy, and what's amazing, Jesus not only fulfilled 300 of them in his lifetime, 30 to 35 of them would be impossible if they weren't miracles. But all these prophets were speaking to the governments at the time. Sure. Every one of them. So how in the world can we say that we're not supposed to be involved, because what the prophets did was say, okay, you're messing up here.
Right.
You have two choices here. You can come with me and obey my law, or you can be taken away by the pagans you're serving.
Right.
That's a big problem.
It is funny because you're right. A lot of the stories in the Bible, right, are stories of people, Moses to the Egyptians, right, Jonah and the whale. I mean, all these different stories all throughout the Bible actually are filled with stories of godly men, right, standing up, even when they didn't want to, right, sometimes, standing up to confront their elected, or at least their government at the time. Back then they wouldn't have been elected, but, just the government leadership at the time. We have it so much easier and better now. I mean, it is such a time that you can make a much bigger impact, I think, individually, and more importantly with other people, right? Nobody's an island in this, world, and I think one of the dangers that it's a narcissistic element of modern society where people believe that because I'm alive today, this is the most significant event in history, right? And part of it's the ignorance of history in general that inspires people to say that. But because so they make themselves the center of the story, so it's always the worst time in the world. It's always, and that ignorance, unfortunately, with the history, when it's been way worse at many times in the past, it really tends to scare people and say, I don't want to be involved because crime is so bad, because our government's so corrupt, because they scare me and they look sideways at me at Costco, and maybe somebody, won't like me at work. I don't know. It's all these kind of excuses.
Exactly.
And so, but at some point in time, you have to be engaged and involved. Now, I understand how people say, well, I can't do what you're doing, Glenn, right, or something like that, which is fine. But you can find to the talents that you have and the skills that you have, find your place where you can make a difference.
Right.
And where your passion is. Maybe it is to protect the children. Maybe it's to help your neighbors in your community. Whatever your passion is on an issue that you can get involved in, it's something that you can do. You find it, and you find other people who share that passion. Whether they're in your church or you disagree with them on other things or not, that's how you find allies. That's how you get together and you do things together that you wouldn't have ever expected that you could do, and you certainly wouldn't if you're sitting in your bunker preparing for the rapture.
Yeah. Well, one thing God has done to shock people is use people outside of the people everyone thought that he was going to use to do things. At a board meeting we just had last week, one of our board members, he said, well, wait, he said exactly what you're saying. What about the Sikh community? What about this community? What about that community? They have the same basic understanding. They do not want, they want parents' rights for their own children in the school. They don't want those rights taken away. And this is common sense. And the Bible is literally the liturgy of common sense. Don't kill your neighbor. Don't steal from him. All this stuff. Don't commit adultery because you're going to break everybody's heart. All this stuff. They're really protections, but they go across other religions as well. And I'm not watering down our faith at all by saying that. However, if we get more people into be discussing these kind of things, we have more allies out there that we really know. We need to not just be relegated to our own little groups. I have this picture that keeps going through my head. And here's this little Christian group, and they're sitting on a train track, and they're having a little Bible study, and they're crying, and they're enjoying the Bible, and it's also exciting. And I'm not saying anything bad about the Bible here. It's just that they don't want to look up from that, but they're on the train track. And here comes the train. And all of a sudden, one of them says, there's a train coming. And they say, well, we looked that up. There's no train in the Bible. That's not actually in my concordance. So they continually having it until they wiped out. And so I see us with a train coming, relegating ourselves to one little tiny place and not reaching out, not bringing the love of Jesus to the people that we really should, or the philosophy. A lot of people don't think about the Bible as a philosophy. They just think it's a religion or whatever it is. But the philosophy of the Bible exists across every culture, because the 10 Commandments literally are in every culture. You're not supposed to kill, steal, and do horrible, immoral things because it breaks everyone's heart around you. So that's what I think what you're saying is very important for all of us to know.
And I think part of it is just this sense that you can make an impact and a difference, right? You can if you're willing to engage. You absolutely won't if you don't, but you can if you're willing to engage. And so I think that that's a difficult thing for people and to necessarily come to, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not. It's just a difficult thing to accept. Sometimes you always think there's big forces beyond your ability. But when you realize that you can make that impact, and it's only going to happen if you show up, then once you start to see that, you'll find other people like-minded, and you're really able to reach out. It's when I talk to people on the left, especially those who were leftists, maybe people I even had big arguments and disputes with a couple years ago, and they've crossed over and they've joined us now in our fight in many ways. And I talk to them, and one of the things that they're always mystified, like, how is it? Why do all these people go to church and they do literally nothing else? They won't be involved in the and they mock it to some. The left mocks us for that.
Yeah.
And they laugh about it because they know that a lot gives them the opportunity, because of all these people who are apathetic or unwilling to participate, right? It gives them the opportunity to do whatever they want to us. And so they're going to feed right into that. They're going to threaten you. They're going to try to say that they'll take away your tax status at church, which I don't think they can do it anyway. But they say that. You know, they'll try to intimidate you. And
the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah, and it's stunning to me how many people fall for that. And at some
or
point in time,
or hide behind it.
Or use that as the convenient excuse.
Yeah.
Because it's always easier to do nothing than to do something. So if somebody gives you an excuse to not do anything, it's just like raising children, right? I have 4 kids. So if you give them an excuse, that's okay. You don't need to do that well in school. That's okay. You don't need to go to practice. That's okay. You don't need to do that well in that race. That's okay. I understand why you talk back to the teacher. You're giving them an excuse for bad behavior.
Yeah.
And so I think Christians, and they're not alone. Believe me, it's not just Christians, but it's this big segment of people who should understand, because of what they believe, there's no excuse to be out there allowing bad things to happen and just look the other way.
Yes.
Whatever excuse you're using to do that is wrong. And so finding the recognition that you can step up and be involved, I think, is a very powerful revelation that people will have when they step through that experience.
Well, and I think that they're missing the best part of their life, when they could be doing something that has a meaning above themselves.
Right.
Like you're talking about the narcissistic tendencies that we have, and we've really raised a narcissistic generation. When the
multiple generations.
Yeah,
now,
multiple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could get the exact date, but when a lot of people think that that what the school system did that was the worst thing was to take prayer out of school. It wasn't that they took prayer out of school. That was a problem, but they changed the worldview of the kids from a biblical worldview, which means God is big, God is in control, and I'm not, to a more narcissistic, I'm in control. Secular humanism became the religion of the day. And secular humanism looks at yourself as the middle of the universe, like you were saying.
Right.
Christian worldview looks at God as the middle of the universe with accountability. So if you're only accountable to yourself and you think that your times are the worst and you make up these own narratives in your mind, how scattered could a people be?
Well, and the other thing is that everyone has a religion. So my atheistic friends that I tend to fight political battles and they happen to be on my side, they have a religion. Right,
yeah.
And it's going to be, they don't want to call it a religion, but it is. When I run into the left and I'm having disputes or differences with them, they have a religion too. Every bit as fanatical as what they're angry about on the Christian side, say.
Yeah.
And their religion could be global warming. Their religion could be this kind of transhumanist sort of movement, right? It could be, but it's their religion. There's an orthodoxy. You can be
hierarchy.
Oh, there's a hierarchy. There's things you can't say. There's things you can't challenge. And it's a weak religion, but it's still a religion nonetheless, and it drives them and motivates them to do terrible and bad things in pursuit of their religious goals and objectives there. And so, if you create a vacuum, right, and remove Christians or this long-standing Christian tradition from what's going on in the community, it gets replaced by a different religion. It doesn't get replaced by nothing. It gets replaced by a different religion. And so, and a much inferior one in the way that it creates, even if you're just going to look at it purely on the impact of society and children and safety and just all the normal metrics of what a healthy society is, they being the left and how they approach things, they replace it with a much worse religion.
Yes, and we've seen by the destruction of every major city in America.
Right.
I mean, they've just collapsed.
Destroying any measurable metric of educational attainment that you could ever use for children, for example, in school. Even the ability to read and believe math is real, or what a woman is. Just fundamental biology. All these things are under attack and destroyed by the religion that the left has decided to put into the vacuum that gets created by the fact that we're not willing to engage as Christians, or as even if you're not going to, because there's a lot of flavors of Christianity, right? There's a lot of I know because I work with people who belong to practically every church that you could imagine at times, and we're and
Right.
like I said, Sikhs and people from other religions too,
Yeah.
and we build them people who claim they're not religious. You're engaged in this process, and so I'm not trying to tell them this is how you interpret this scripture or this is a doctrinally
Right.
questionable thing, but we can all find this common ground, right?
Right.
We actually don't want our neighbors to be murdered and killed, right? We actually don't think it's a good idea to take violent sex predators who abuse children and stick in our neighborhoods. We actually think it's good for kids to learn how to read and do math, and that they should be able to distinguish what a man and a woman is. These common sense things, with not hard to find allies.
Yeah.
What's amazing is that people are intimidated from standing up for these issues for really the least amount of excuse that they can find, and a fear that I think is overblown and also embarrassing when you really look at that excuse that they're using to not be involved.
Yeah, well, on that issue, when it happened in Tenino, and you're from that area, right? They were going to put that house there. They were going to take people off the island and put them in the regular community. That was for me, it was a hair on fire moment. We have got to stop this. And pastors, let me just talk to pastors right now. I had fear of saying something about that. And I'll just be honest, oh my gosh, people are going to get real mad at me. It's going to be a reprisal. But then I had to get to myself in prayer, and I had to say, the truth is the truth. We need to live in the truth and let God separate the people or whatever. Well, I had actually families leave the church because I said we've got to stand up and not allow these heinous sexual predators in our neighborhoods. Literally left the church because I said that. So it is a risk, and I understand it. But this is what I don't think many pastors are getting. The people that came in and replaced them, oh my gosh, God has transformed our church into a way that we're very powerful, we're very united. Every single miracle in the book of Acts was they were all together in one place with a united heart. They said one accord. So that's what we're doing. And the thing is that if people don't want truth, then let them go. If it's God's church, he'll add to it, he'll take care of it, and you'll be fine. So I just want to reach out to pastors and say, if it's the truth, say it. If you're preparing your sermon and there's a narrative that goes along with what's going on in the culture, you can't leave it out. You've got to risk. You've got to do it. Jesus risked. We need to risk, and it's really important. Okay, we're going to say something about that because I want to move on to a couple of things we want to talk about.
Well, and I know that you're right about that. Speak truth to power, and which is a funny phrase, really from the '60s that still applies today. And if you're willing to be a leader, people will follow. If you're afraid to lead, then you really need to question your life choices.
Well, I think so. So, okay, here's another question. That was just rapture and end times. That was
sure.
That was a lot. So we've got this, guys. Where's which camera am I on here? This one.
You are on the middle one.
Okay. All right. So next question is, how do you think that the assassination attempt on former President Donald J. Trump and the subsequent stepping down and stepping aside of Joe Biden has changed the narrative in America?
Well, I mean, the narrative itself, of course, is pretty dramatic because you've got this idea where the media and the political elite have told us up until last week that this guy was President Biden was totally sharp as a tack, that's exact quote, that he was leading the country, and then suddenly you had this sudden change.
Right.
I think the thing that people have to realize is that not everybody is telling us the truth.
Really? You've got to be kidding.
Yeah,
this is an aha moment, everyone.
Right. And they'll collude to lie.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that everything's a conspiracy, but there's a fairly predictable human nature element to this that we have to always remind ourselves there's nothing new under the sun. This has been done for generations, right? But when a political entity has the objective to maintain power, they will do almost anything to retain it.
Yes.
And so it is healthy and normal to question and be skeptical of what you're being told. Always question. I think it's an important thing. And debate it and be able to talk about these issues. And this desire of an established history, it's a big deal in America. It is not the first time they've done that in America. It happened under FDR when he was unhealthy and they were trying to keep it secret. It happened under JFK when they were trying to hide his infidelities from the country. It happened under Woodrow Wilson when he actually had a stroke and was completely incapable of functioning as president. in modern times, that's really scary because you have nuclear weapons, you have all these other things that are going on. So the question, of course, is who's actually running the country.
Yeah.
The threat against Donald Trump is even more dramatic because now suddenly we're back to this. The last time this happened was when I was a kid when Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981.
Remember it well.
Yeah, and so fortunately he survived. And fortunately Donald Trump survived. But it was a very close thing. And so I think sometimes these are the crazy events that occur that wake people up. Everybody has a different threshold that wakes them up. I don't know what it is all the time. You can't always predict it. What we're seeing now is a lot of people waking up, and this is serious. This is life and death in a lot of ways on what's happening in our future, and we need to be paying attention to it. We cannot hide in our bunker and just pretend like it's going to, that it doesn't involve us. This affects everybody.
It really affects everyone. It's interesting that when Donald Trump turned his head, he was going to be looking at the statistics of the border.
Right.
Right then when he turned his head, he didn't even get his head all the way there, and the shot came through.
Right.
So I think that's significant.
Yeah.
And from a biblical or a prophetic view, the first thing that hit my mind when that happened was circumcision of the ear, which means you got too much flesh. Mm-hmm. And biblically, in what you're listening to, we need to clip this back a little bit. And I think all Christians would think of Donald J. Trump. He's a little in the flesh. Mm-hmm. He's a little crazy out there. And he needs to be. He needs to be who he is and fully on who he is. However, I just thought a little bit of the flesh needed to come off. That was my take on that. So another question, number 2. As you know, we're in, like we're talking, extremely volatile election cycle. How do you think the national chaos and disarray of the Democratic Party with Joe Biden stepping aside and putting Kamala Harris in there, which I believe is the darling of DEI, mm-hmm. Rising into position, do you think that well, number one, I'll just say this, because they missed him, and because now we see that there are 3 guns and there's all sorts of conspiracy stuff, I'm not going to go into that.
Right.
But because we don't know yet, and there's just so much of it. But one thing I'm hearing is more people are talking about God. God must have done that. God must have done that. And even on the left and the right. And so what are your thoughts on that? Not only the, well, I have 3 thoughts that I want to do. And
all right, give them to me and I'll see if I can answer them.
Well, just go back to the original. How do you think that the switch with Kamala Harris and the diversity, equity, and inclusion whole thing, because that we're not talking about competency here.
Right.
Not to be mean or anything like that, but this is the essence of incompetence.
Well, the one thing is, if you live your life in lies and you structure yourself with lies, inevitably the lies catch up to you. They will. And so what we're really seeing here is not so much a DEI issue as much as that very philosophy is based on a lie, right? So when you start to build your foundation on lies, your belief system, which the Democrats clearly have, and really big government in a lot of ways has, they built this system on lies, and that's why they want censorship. That's why they want us to be coward in our church and hiding out for the rapture, right? They want us to be afraid to confront them because the lies can't survive the light of day. And what's happening is the lies are being exposed.
Yeah.
And so what you can't do, if you want to have outcomes that are good, you can't just keep building on your lies. And so I think Kamala Harris is just another manifestation of the lie. She probably, generally, if you're running for political office, this is just a practical thing. And she was not able to even get through their own Democrat primary back in 2020. She was so bad. Yeah, not even that. And so if you're literally that bad as a candidate at that level, your own voters, many of whom might probably disagree with their priorities and how they vote, but even your own voters don't like this person. Putting them in as vice president and now kind of anointing them as the next president is a result of lies in the first place. And I don't know that series of lies produces the result that they think they want. Now, it raises bigger questions about who's actually running the country, what other lies they want to tell us to justify or excuse bad behavior or things that they're doing right now. We need to be on our guard and aware that the lies, there's a father of lies out there. and
yes, there is.
And so when we see these lies manifest like this in government, we need to be really on our guard as to where that's going, because these lies on top of lies is a house of cards that collapses. And we need to be aware of that and paying attention to it. And there is nothing wrong with exposing the truth.
Right.
And so we have to continually be truth tellers in a world filled with lies. And It's not an easy process, and it doesn't mean you have to go out and do dumb things or offensive things to people who disagree with you. I don't think
Right.
that's an effective means of changing the way
Right.
things are, but I think you have to stick to what you believe and be honest. And I would hope that Christians take that to heart and understand how important that is. Hiding is not a solution, right? Staying at home won't be the solution, but showing up to try to make an impact is a solution. And when we see this whirlwind of lies going on out there, it's a sign that something's collapsing on the other side. We need to be there to pick up probably what ends up being some bad outcomes. We're going to have to clean up a mess that's
Right.
been created here. We have to fix what's broken.
Yeah. Two things I want to get in here before we go is, number one, the initiatives. Brian Haywood. We're talking about one person. We're talking about Abraham Lincoln. We're talking about Wilberforce and way back when. Well, here's a guy that decided to do something about it and put his money down on the line. And so talk just a few minutes about what happened with Brian Haywood.
Right.
How did this happen? And briefly tell us, because this is a real win.
It is. It's a significant win, and it's and Brian Haywood, for those who don't know, right, is the one who funded the Let's Go Washington project to launch and get 6 initiatives across the finish line recently, and then another bonus one just about a month ago. I saw you there. We talked at the signature sheet turn-in at the Secretary of State's office. The significance of this is one guy who, admittedly, he has resources, so he's more resources than most of us would have. And what I find is people who have resources are afraid, right? They're afraid to risk their resources. So usually what they do is they sit back and they're very careful about not using those resources to do the right thing. And what you see with him is interesting and very different, I think, is that he was willing to try. I mean, remember 2 years ago, he tried to do 11 initiatives, and it failed.
Yeah.
So all that money he spent on that failed. It went away. And he's not so wealthy that that's a nothing thing for him. That was real, but he's also a business guy, and he was heavily involved, and he learns from his lessons. And he didn't run away in a huff and go live in a mansion somewhere. He decided, I'm going to take my money again, and I'm going to try this to do it right. I learned my lessons last time, and do it right this time. I interviewed him and had a couple videos about that interview, and I think you really see who this guy is because he's willing to take his own money. And I'm going to point out that when he spent that money last year to get those 6 initiatives approved across the finish line, other people had promised to give him money so that he wouldn't have to spend all of his own money. And then they never came through with it.
Wow.
And so he was left hanging out there. And you don't hear him out there complaining about it. You don't hear him attacking other people. You don't hear him running away and crying in his, at home. He just simply made it happen. And to demonstrate to people, and I think that's a real act of leadership, to demonstrate that you can be successful in this process. I've never seen anybody in the state of Washington, in my lifetime anyway, stand up in that way with those kind of resources and a lot to risk, still being willing to go and do it.
Yeah.
And leadership tends to demonstrate itself, and so people want to join with him. You'll notice the recent initiative, which was the one to repeal the gas ban, the natural gas ban, that he just submitted in. That was the second largest signature collection effort in the history of the state of Washington for one initiative. And they turned in so many that, several 100,000 more than they needed. Brian didn't fund that one. Brian ran the Let's Go Washington, program that he'd set up, but he helped show that you could do it more efficiently than any of the consultants or other people could do in the past, and demonstrated that it wasn't just a fluke. So what's interesting here with this, as the left, in trying to fight back against these initiatives, remember 3 of them became law. I mean, the legislature felt like they were so overwhelmed they had to pass 3 of them, even though the Democrats in the legislature didn't want to. Parental choice, police pursuit, and no income tax, right? They were forced to pass it just so they could fight on the money, because the other 3 that are showing up on the ballot in November, and the 4th one now, all 4 of them, they have a very simple campaign: vote yes, pay less. It reduces your cost of living if you vote yes.
So they're going to be on the top of the ballot.
Top of the ballot, ahead of the president. Yeah, they're the first things on the ballot in Washington State are those 4 initiatives. And everybody who cares about fiscal sanity, the cost of living, their future freedom, they're going to vote yes. Regular people. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, or how you. If you want to reduce your cost of living, you're going to vote yes on those things. The left knows this is a problem. Big government knows it's a problem, and Brian represents a threat to them. And so their whole ad campaign, of which it looks like they're going to spend about $30 million, isn't so much to attack the initiatives, is to attack Brian Haywood. You see all the ads. It's a total personal attack on him. I don't. They probably did polling and they realized that they were popular initiatives. And so what they're trying to do is attack a person. The other thing they want to do is they want to scare away other people from doing the same thing. Because if they can put enough pressure and threats on this guy, then maybe they can convince, because he's scary, right? They don't want him to keep doing it. Maybe they can convince him to stop doing it. Maybe they can convince him to go away. They can intimidate him. That's what they're trying to do. That is how they operate. And by the way, when you start to see this type of behavior, it's indicative of a corruption on the inside for them. Because by attacking this guy, they're basically admitting that the policies are probably very popular. I know they are. And so they're trying to throw everything that they can at Brian Haywood individually. And that's one guy standing up and doing the right thing. Now, he has more talents, and go back to the parable analogy, right? He has more talents and resources than I do or that you do, but he's using them to do good things.
Yeah.
And so many people who do have those talents, they don't. And we should be thankful for that, I think.
We should absolutely be thankful for that and pray for him daily because of the attacks that he's had. So for the person that relegates themselves to the background and saying, well, I don't have that kind of money, I can't do that. Well, how many people did it take to actually do all that work? He actually, the first time he didn't have hired help, right?
Right.
He just had volunteer help and that didn't work. Then he actually hired people, paid them a wage, and they went out and did the work and got things done. So but what I'm saying is that there's a place for everybody.
Right.
From walking around telling people, handing out a pamphlet or whatever it is, or just on your own social media. Everybody has 100 people watching them.
Right.
Everyone does. So just by putting it out there and having those little snippets to go out, there's so much we can do. I wanted to mention in this that we are pretty closely tied to the FPIW, the Family Policy Institute of Washington. On their website, you can get all this great information.
Right.
They do a great job. Brad and Kelly Payne go to church here, and we're going to actually have Ken Ramey, who's a part of them, speaking this Sunday. So that'll be really, really good. Kelly Payne came from the RNC, where she was sitting not very far away from Trump at all, and so she gave a big testimony last week in our service.
Wow.
So we're really trying to keep up with what's going on in not only local politics, but national as well, because we're really in the cycle.
And Pastor Dave, if I could address something, because you raise a good issue. People will look at someone like Brian Haywood and say, well, I could never do that, right?
Right.
That's not an excuse to be apathetic or not do anything. What it means is look at your talents that you do have, and your skills that you have, your friend network that you do have, and find out what is it that I can do that's good and right and moves the path forward in a good and right position.
Yeah.
It's different for everybody, but if you're aware, self-aware, and you can look and find out what that is, and I do training courses all the time for people, for activists, to help them find that. But when they find that skill, to go out and actually make an impact and find others that you can do the same thing with.
Well, and the personal impact is what I'd like to talk about. When you're truly involved with something that is good, that's righteous, it's above you, a lot of the self-centered or dismantling of your own self. When you have something that's bigger than you, that's outside of you, that you're a part of, that you're affecting, it changes your worldview. From a self-centered to an outside focus. Outside focus is very, very powerful, because then you're not just looking on the inside and thinking about all the things you have to do. You have something that's way more important, and you can walk past a lot of things, traumas and different things in your life, by just having a goal and to be involved with people like Brian.
Sure, because without a vision, the people perish, and so you
That's
gotta
a
have
good
your
verse.
vision. Yep, it is.
I'm the one that should have said that. Good taking my line. All right, what else do we have here before we go? I want to talk about the state governor's race. It is extremely important. We've got Bob Ferguson on one side. We've got Riker and Byrd on the other side. And so how do you see, you know a lot about Bob Ferguson. So give us a little bit of information about this guy. Who is he? What is he? Where's the deal?
And I think Bob Ferguson's worth discussing a little bit more, because he is our Attorney General right now. He's established himself over the last 12 years as somebody who's willing to be very corrupt and manipulate that process in a very corrupt manner. Many different examples of this. It isn't a word that I use lightly. It's one that really perfectly applies to him and his behavior. What people have to pay attention to, I think, particularly Christians, in looking at who this guy is he has actively used his office to persecute He is a persecutor of Christians. He
Yes.
explicitly has set his office up to persecute people with religious beliefs. He has done this to go after pro-life organizations repeatedly. He has done it to go after Marlene Flowers over in the Tri-Cities with her flower shop because she didn't want to support same-sex marriage, even though that law, when it was passed originally, said, we would protect the conscience of religious people. That's not true. He dedicated himself to enormous resources to aggressively and completely over the top attack her and destroy her life. Same thing even here in at the stores locally, right? Trying to force whatever, his religion, whatever his religious views are about government. He'll say it's not religion, right? But it is. It's his religion, and he's used that to persecute political enemies and religious, specifically Christians. He is an enemy of anybody who believes in these good things.
Right.
He's a fan of releasing violent sex predators in our neighborhoods. He's actively engaged himself personally and signed the documents himself to release, or directed others on his behalf to sign them, to release these violent sex predators in our community. Yeah. So this is not a good person. Whoever comes out of the primary to run against Bob Ferguson, most surveys would say that's probably going to be Reichert, but whoever that is, that's who we need to get behind. Imperfect or not, whoever's running against Ferguson is a far better choice. You don't put the persecutor in government if you have that choice.
And he is not only planned persecuting, but he just has a long-standing record, like you're saying. Seattle, this article I got today, just the first little bit. Seattle, following the lawsuit brought by Alliance Defending Freedom, attorneys, Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson officially closed his unconstitutional investigation into 2 faith-based pro-life pregnancy centers.
Right.
So he went after these guys with all the power of the government of Washington, trying to shut down these folks that are trying to comfort and aid these young women that are, I mean, how horrible is that? Young women get pregnant, they go to school, they go to sex education, they don't have any morality, they just go out and have sex, and then all of a sudden they're pregnant, and then these gals and these guys in these pregnancy centers, which we're a part of one, they just want to comfort them and try to help them through the process of having that, because the emotional strain on these kids, it's like life-changing. So he's literally trying to attack them and shut them down from trying to bring life into our community rather than the death sentence of Planned Parenthood.
And he's done this repeatedly. And he's done this endlessly. Every time he's had an opportunity, he persecutes people like that who he disagrees with politically and ideologically, right? And when he's told to do so by leftist organizations. So it doesn't matter if you're Tim Eyman and you were trying to reduce taxes. It doesn't matter if you were, a business group trying to improve the community. Whoever you are, he's gone after you if he felt like he'd get some percentage out of it. And at the same time that he's done that, he's willfully turned a blind eye to violence, to criminal activity, to corruption in government. Even when he's been notified and given evidence, he refuses to ever do anything about that because he views that as unimportant. It's his priority to go after people who he disagrees with. And he's made it that priority at every stage of this process. It's been exceptional, and it is unusual in the way that he stands out in this way. And I'm going to point out, it's not even a partisan thing. A lot of Democrats have come out, including one of the candidates running for governor right now. And in fact, he's done a better job than some of the Republicans in pointing out and confronting Bob Ferguson on his history of corruption and dishonesty and willingness to do terrible things to little people if he thinks he can get away with it. Yeah. So that the governor's race in our state is a big deal. And really we've got the scenario where we've got a really bad person running and everybody else that could come out of the primary. We have a top 2 primary system, so only one other person's going to be facing off with him after August. And so in the November election, it's whoever's against Bob Ferguson is a better choice.
Yeah. So what do you know of his affiliation or part in the homeless industrial complex is? What is the deal there? I think people are confused. Why is the left stacking up just literally and promoting and spending literally billions of dollars now
Right.
And we don't have any relief from this at all.
No, in fact, the homeless industrial complex, which is what we've been calling it now for a number of years, and I first started looking at this about 8-9 years ago when I was really starting to see public meetings where these groups were coming in you'd never heard of before, and they were taking millions of dollars to solve a problem that kept getting worse the more money they got. In fact, in 2014 in Olympia, I was the one who came in and testified and wrote the con statement on a property tax increase that supposedly was going to help homelessness. And It only got worse after that. And one of the groups that was on the other side of me was one of these nonprofits that was collecting the money that was going to come in. And I confronted them in the editorial board debate that we had at the Olympian at the time, that the more money they got, the worse it was going to get. And they didn't even deny that. Because And so what we've really seen now, and you can see this in Portland, right, where they claim they were going to have try to address fentanyl deaths, right? Because drug addiction and homelessness really all are linked together.
Sure they are.
And they've become the excuse for dishonest people to basically, that's their facade that they use to collect a lot of our taxpayer dollars.
Right.
And the dollars aren't going to be used to solve the problem. The dollars are actually going to be used to ensure the problem continues and gets worse, because it's created this perverse incentive for organizations to justify their existence so long as the problem continues. So you saw that in Seattle or Portland area where they had more people die for a fentanyl overdose when they said they were going to focus on it, right? More people died, not less. A lot more did.
And that's just the raw facts.
It is.
The
There's
more
no way
money
to
you
deny
go,
this.
the more it goes. And
Yeah.
this affects us. We have family in our church. Their son was on drugs. He got off of drugs. He was clean and sober for 4 years.
Yeah.
And one person just said, "Hey, try this," and it was fentanyl, and boom, in 2 hours the man was dead.
Yeah.
He's 20 years old, or
Horrible stories.
very, very young. And in our family right now, my wife's middle daughter, her best friend that she's had for a long time,
Yeah.
just died last week, fentanyl overdose.
Yeah.
And we know the people that sold it to him and all this kind of stuff. This is touching all families.
It is. It is. I
Across
have
the
a
board.
cousin whose girlfriend, he came home and found her dead at home from a drug overdose, in Federal Way not that long ago.
Yeah.
This is affecting everybody, and and this homeless industrial complex is the excuse and the facade for us to actually maintain and continue it. There's a genuine. We don't want to believe that people who stand up and say they're doing good things are lying to us, but they are. And you'll see this because there are organizations that do genuinely try to get people off drugs. They actively focus on that, right? And they've been, and some of them have been doing it for decades. They've been doing it a long time. Those groups get cut out of the grant process. They oftentimes get attacked by the left. The left will sometimes come in and take them over so that they can change their program.
Right.
Even when I mentioned to you in the editorial board, right, one of the organization that was going to get all this money from this home, it was millions of dollars out of Olympia. I can't remember the name of the group now, but they were critical of Christian organizations that were forcing people to stop taking drugs, and they were actively trying to undermine and take out any church group that could potentially be involved in trying to get people off drugs. They don't care about people being on drugs. They seem to inspire and want more of it, and it's self-serving because they want bigger grant dollars. And this is, every time we look into this, it only gets worse, and people have to wake up and realize government will not be the solution to this problem.
Right.
It can't make it worse, and that's what they're doing right now, but it won't be the solution, because in the end, this is a very individualized sort of effort that we have to do in an outreach to help people get off drugs. That's the biggest part of this. It's not the only part, but it's certainly the biggest. And the other one is just to have a reasonable approach to people with mental health issues when they're genuinely not in their right mind. Now, drugs makes it worse, but when they're not in their right mind, and if you could solve a couple of these things and have reasonable solutions and help for people like that, then we would not only not be squandering so much money, but we wouldn't be funding this evil, I think, that's actually behind making it worse and worse all the time.
And not only that, but it's true that they've literally reached out to people across the nation. I mean, a few years ago, someone in our family was running around the nation and basically outside of the will of God and with all that community. And she heard literally all across the nation, well, let's go to Olympia,
Yeah, they recruit drug addicts.
To
that
bring
they
them
have
in.
easier, and they sold them. I have a copy of the flyer I put up on my article. I wrote an article about this back in 2014, 2014 or 15, and I put up copies of the flyers that they were handing out in Detroit and Chicago and Georgia, and Atlanta, right, where they were recruiting drug addicts to come out to Washington and Olympia specifically. So that because nothing's going to happen to you, they'll let you camp on the streets, fentanyl's all over the place. And everything's free, right? Free food, free tent. You're subsidizing self-destructive behavior, and our taxpayer dollars are being used to do this. And so that's the problem with the homeless industrial complex. And a lot of Christians fall for the sob story that these organizations put together, and they're lying. And most of them that are left in the state now, they've generally squeezed out most of the results-oriented solutions that people have about trying to get people off drugs. And there's a lot of concerns about how much is organized crime now, whether it's the drug cartels and stuff that are behind a lot of these organizations, because that gives them their market is free and clear, and they get the extra bonus of getting money from the government back to them. Like, the same people making money off selling fentanyl, they don't mind taking your taxpayer dollars and funneling it back to their organizations. And no one's looking. Bob Ferguson specifically has ignored this. He's willfully turned a blind eye to it. He's actively encouraged more of this behavior all the time. There isn't a single example that I can find until recently, when he suddenly pretends like he cares, because he realizes in his own polling that he is bad on law and order. Most people recognize him as not a guy that's going to help make Washington safer. He's going to make it less safe. So he's trying to pretend now, despite a 12-year history of looking the other way, letting people die, letting these organizations do dishonest and criminal activity, and never, ever trying to investigate it.
Yeah. In fact, in our neighborhood, there's a Ferguson for governor sign in these people's yard. I just want to go ask him, what redeeming qualities has he brought to our state?
And it's worth talking to him in a polite and friendly way.
Yeah.
But find out.
Well, I really would just kind of like to know.
Yeah,
I mean, I could be
say?
jovial, have fun, hey, well, tell me, well, who should I, act like a dummy or something?
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, tell me why he's great. Because I'm I talk to a lot of Democrats, and most Democrats I talk to don't like Bob Ferguson. Some of them are still voting for him because they don't like Republicans even more. But they don't necessarily like this guy. And so they've seen or heard, or this is where we live in, the center of government is in our county, Thurston County, right? Not far away from where we're doing this video. So in this area, roughly 52% of the people live in Thurston County, either work in government or they're married to somebody that is. So there's somebody in their household that works in government. So this is where everybody here knows, generally, or they know of somebody, 6 degrees of separation. They know what's going on. Yeah. And when you talk to these people, they may not say it on camera, but they're quite aware of the corruption and dishonesty that the Attorney General personally has had. And we need to be aware of the threat that represents to our community and our children and our future. These are not the kind of people you want to put in charge when they're totally willing to allow some of the most evil sorts of behavior, and they look the other way, and in fact spend their time attacking pro-life groups or Tim Eyman or somebody else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and they do. There's wonderful groups out there. Not only the Salvation Army is great, but there's another one, what are they called? City Gates Ministries. And they even go as far as to say that they want to make illegal conversion therapy, which is what we would be doing, converting them from a drug addict to a citizen. I remember back in the 90s, I was pastoring a small church in California. And what had happened is back in the 60s and 70s, the hippies, they went back to nature. Well, actually what they did was they relegated their life back to these little towns in Northern California and did meth. So I arrived and they've been on meth for 20 years. Now, believe it or not, it was awesome. Well, you probably know this, but when Clinton was in office, he was out philandering around doing all sorts of things that were not government things. And Dole, and I forget which other one, they made a law that you could only be on welfare for 5 years. That was the most beautiful thing. Because when I would walk into, knock on a family's door, and they would be on welfare and on drugs. And I'd say, well, come give your heart to God and you'll have a new life. They'll say, well, what are we going to do for money? So when they said that, and I was very involved with all of their lives. We fed them at Christmas, fed them at Thanksgiving, and so they knew who we were, and they would come to us in crises. But when that happened, boy, they doubled the size of the church in no time, because they came to me and said, Pastor, they're taking away our money. You got to pray that they give it back. And I said, I'm going to pray that you get a job.
Right, and so more important than them going to church was the fact that they had to change their life.
They had to change everything.
Yeah, they had to change it and fix and address the issues that they're facing, right?
Yes.
And again, I bring it back to this whole idea that if you have no consequences for your children, right, and you allow them to have really bad behavior, or you subsidize bad behavior, then you're going to get more of it. And
Right.
that's the type of thing that we see government stepping in and doing the wrong thing. And
Yeah.
so that's why it's important to be involved and engaged. I think we all need to. And again, you find your own way. We can't all be Brian Haywoods, right? But we can find
But
a
we
path.
can help the process.
We can help
we
the
can
process.
show up when they
We-
bring in the ballots and,
Right.
and be a part of the whole thing.
And I've done many videos on my YouTube channel, as you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
and I've got,
Everybody watches YouTube channel.
and We
It's
the Governed,
awesome.
on YouTube.
We
And
the Governed.
At the end of it, I always say, the future belongs to those who show up,
There it is.
and it's absolutely true.
It is.
And so, if you want to make a difference, you got to start showing up.
So let's go ahead and end on that. I guess we could probably talk forever because we are talking people. So we want to thank Glen Morgan for coming in. We want to thank you guys for watching. We're going to get this out in a few days. We're going to do some clips on it and get it to you. So when we get it out, we need you to like and share it. We're going to put it on the Remnant US YouTube channel and on our Facebook site. So we want to get this kind of thing out to Christians. We can be involved. We can make a difference. But we have to show up because the future
Absolutely belongs to those who show up.
Thank you. God bless you all. That was great.